And this is the second of a series of talks that I'm going to give about St. John Climacus' ladder of divine ascent. And that's about 1,400 years old. It's a classic. It's a book written for monks. Not an easy book. It's a book that bears sort of reading and meditating, and it's not always obvious how we can apply this book to life in the world. But we'll be looking at that question. The book is organized around the idea of 30 steps to heaven. And there is a certain logical sequence to the steps. The first step is to renounce the world. This first step, we discussed the first step at the last presentation. It's the decision to choose Christ over a world that is passing away. All right. Well, I wake up in the morning, I've got that decision again. And tomorrow I'm going to wake up and I'm still going to be on step 1 in 10 years. So it is sequential, but not in a certain sense. There's a logical sequence here. Okay, renunciation of the world is the first step. And it doesn't come without pain. All right? Let me read a little section out of on step 2, which is detachment. Right? Violence, and then the strong words here that it uses. Right? Violence and unending pain are the lot of those who aim to ascend to heaven with the body. And of course, we are embodied creatures, and that's the idea. Going to heaven with our bodies. And this especially at the early stages of the enterprise, when our pleasure-loving disposition and our unfeeling hearts must travel through overwhelming grief for the love of God and holiness. It is hard, truly hard. There has to be an abundance of invisible bitterness, especially for the careless, until our mind is brought through simplicity, deep freedom from anger, and diligence to a love of holiness and guidance. All right. Grief, right? We renounce the world. We still have attachments to the world. And giving these things up entails a certain grief and sorrow that has to be worked through. It's not simply a matter of deciding to follow Christ. It's shaking off all the things that make it difficult. Again, referring to the icon that I talked about last week of St. John Climacus, which we don't have, but the icon is a classic. It's a ladder to heaven, 30 steps on it probably, and Jesus is at the top. And St. John Climacus is at the bottom teaching monks about the steps to heaven. And there are monks on the steps going up to heaven, and they're being attacked by various devils, and some of them are making it, and some of them fail. And of course, one of the points here is that we have to keep our eyes on the goal, which is Jesus, if we're to make it. Just like St. Peter, right, when he was walking over the water to Christ, he began to flounder when his eyes sort of diverted from the goal, and he sort of lost it. And Jesus saved it. Okay. So, still talking about renunciation. We have to choose a way of life life in solitude, or life with a spiritual father, or life in a community of monks. And there is, for most of us, life in the world. And one of the points that St. John makes is it's a very risky business to get to heaven alone. Now, he's thinking primarily of monks who are living in solitude. But we need each other. And when St. John talks about life in the world, he emphasizes the importance of the church and the services, and he emphasizes the importance of our community and our support for each other. So we really need each other to make it, especially in the world. Detachment. All right. You can renounce the world and still remain attached to the world. So there is the fundamental choice, and then there are the specifics. The pain comes in the form of grief as we detach ourselves. St. John talks about 3 forms of detachment from the world. One is the detachment from worldly concerns. And this means one thing for the monk, and I think it means something rather different for the lay people in the world. Even for monks, though, there's a temptation to think that having chosen that path, that we could do more good, abandoning the path that we've chosen and going back to the world and helping others, preaching, teaching, dealing with our family or whatever. So there is that. For those of us in the world, we have worldly concerns, our families especially, our friends, the needs of daily life. You know, things are not as simple as monasticism. And for us, we need to make a distinction between having worldly concerns and anxiety about worldly concerns. That's the issue for us. We need to trust. And Jesus has a couple of parables that highlight this. The parable of the lilies of the field, right? I didn't look it up, but it goes something like, consider the birds of the air. Consider the lilies of the field and how they grow. They neither sow nor reap, but Solomon in all his glory is not arrayed like one of these lilies. So the point that Jesus is making is to avoid anxiety, to trust. When difficult things may come our way, but we have to believe that God has put these issues in our path for our sake. Another one, consider the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap, but their Father in heaven takes care of them. Right? So that's the attitude that we need to strive for with respect to worldly concerns. And it's not simply a matter of waking up tomorrow morning and saying, I'm not going to be worried about this. All right? So this step is a step we're going to be taking every day and the rest of our lives. Okay. Now, St. John talks about selfish attachments. And there isn't too much to say about this, but there's a lot that we have to do about this. Our lives, our daily lives, are spent pampering ourselves, tending to our selfish desires. And whether this affects others or not directly, it does prevent us from serving God. In particular, it prevents us from seeing the image of Christ in the person that we meet. If we are obsessed with whatever it is that we want, then we are not, then my neighbor, my spouse, my child is not an image of Christ for me. They say that it was characteristic of the monks in Egypt that they would prostrate themselves before a visitor because they saw a visitor as an image of Christ. Just as Abraham, when he was visited by the three angels, and Lot also was visited by the angel, showed them hospitality. So the very virtue of hospitality illustrates this business of we have got to detach ourselves from the things that we want, from the passions that drive us, because they prevent us from loving others. There's another one here, another area of detachment. And this you might call Phariseeism. And it illustrates an important point or issue in ascetical struggle. Let's see, you could also call it the vanity of obedience. Seeking the approval of others for seeming to put God first in our lives. It's a kind of hypocrisy. Right? And it's a risk for religious people, especially. Now, St. John talks about this in terms of plants that are watered by sewage and fertilized with manure, transplanted to the desert, and they die. And what he was getting at is people who are involved in asceticism for basically selfish personal motives, who are doing it for the sake of appearance and the approval of others. When they go live in the desert, that's all gone, and it all collapses, right? Now, what does asceticism look like in someone who's an ascetic? Well, Jesus warns us, right? We wash our faces, we don't cover, we wear sackcloth and douse ashes on ourselves for the most part. Some ash Wednesday. That's but we don't get up on Thursday morning put ashes on ourselves. I think, I was thinking about people that what are the signs that this or that person is engaged in ascetical struggle? I think the first sign of that, or the most prominent sign, is they are attentive to the image of Christ in others. Right? That's the first thing. And I think of people like Pope Benedict. I think of how he talks, his style, his words, his actions. And he strikes me as a true ascetic. Just from his gentleness and his basic posture and attitude towards people. Right? He's a most logical man, most rational man, one of the greatest theologians of our time, in my opinion. He is also a very loving man. So he's a man that combines deep rationality with the deep love for people. obviously, I can't hide some things from my spouse, right? Like what I'm eating. But, and for the most part, it's decisions moment by moment, day by day. The cumulative effect of this people know this, they see it. They see it as sanctity, but they don't see it as this guy is whipping himself with cords, starving himself, and all that. Okay, so we have to be very careful about it. Anything ascetic that we do should not be broadcast to the world. Okay. There. The bottom line is this, with respect to detachment. When God takes something away from us, can we accept it without anger, frustration, or despair? That's the bottom line. We don't get there by a decision that we made yesterday. Do we grieve over the loss of the world? Do we not just decide to turn our backs on the world? I'm sorry. We don't just decide to turn our backs on the world, but we have to work through that grief. And that's the point of that first thing quote that I made from St. John. All right, step 3. Step 2 is detachment. Step 3 is exile. It's inevitable that if we renounce the world, in some respects, we'll feel alone and separated from people who haven't. Now a monk decides to go and live with monks. Right? So, in a certain sense, the exile is a physical one for a monk. For those of us living in the world, I think it means often the sensation or the feeling that we're strangers, that other people maybe don't understand. But there's a danger, and so we have to accept that walls, that we're not going to be, that part of the renunciation, part of what we're giving up, is the camaraderie of the world, right? But there's also a risk, even in relationships with fellow exiles, with Christians. Now, in the monastery, this takes a form of particular relationships when monks develop attachments to other specific monks, and that has certain consequences for life in the monastery. For us in the world, well, we have spouses, we have family, we have friends, and the bottom line for us is, do we put God first? There's always a risk that we would put our relationships with whoever ahead of our relationship to Christ. And Jesus warns us of this. Anybody who loves father and mother and sister and brother more than me, it makes it very clear. And when Jesus talks about allowing the dead to bury the dead. And this is not a matter of abandoning our parents, but putting God first. And once we put God first, then our other relationships fall into place. They can. But conflicts can still arise. Conflicts, and we have to choose God first. All right. So, again, starting from step one, renunciation is the fundamental choice. Detachment is the grief that we have to work through as we sort of free ourselves to follow Christ. And exile is the result that we have to accept. That's part of the cross. Sometimes even exile from family or fellow Christians. Step 4, almost, is obedience. All right, so I'll just say a couple things about obedience. St. John talks a lot about spiritual fatherhood in the monasteries. This is almost, the spiritual writers say that this is pretty much a phenomenon of history that's even disappeared from monasteries. But spiritual fatherhood, in the sense of somebody that we can obey explicitly on our day-to-day decisions, is just not in the cards for us. But we do have options. I mean, we do have opportunities for obedience. And so step 4 talks about obedience as a step. The importance of obedience, this is a quote here. Obedience is burial of the will, self-mistrust up to one's dying day in every matter, even the good. So it's having a posture of distrust for your own motives in everything you do. So you're going to look for confirmation from spiritual fathers, right? Now, there's much that we could say about that, and we will the next time. But we have spiritual fathers. Even if we're a boss, even if we're an employer or a parent, we can, if we listen to our children, listen to our employees, they can function as spiritual fathers to us. It's not easy. So our spouse can be a spiritual father to us. And some of us, in any case, well, I sort of had a joke, and I think I'll save it for next time. Time is really up. So we'll